And given the limited time we allocated for the talks, we will leave the questions after the talks. For any other questions, please get in touch with us by email. And normally Manfred Krivka, the director of DAS, would have been here with you to welcome you. However, today he's really detained in another workshop. And just before finishing, also a big shout to our students, Maite, Janelle, and Lucy, who put a lot of work in setting up all the logistics so that everything is running smoothly. And thanks to Suzanne for setting up the webpage, and thanks to Anton and Stephanie and Wooly, who supported this project that the workshop is based on. So thanks everyone for taking us the time with you today. And now I will move on. Just I will try to sort of take a minute before every slot just to introduce each speaker to make sure that everyone has the full hour. So it is my pleasure to introduce Alessandra Tanesini. So she's professor of philosophy at Cardiff University. She works in philosophy of language, ethics, feminist and social epistemology. And she has written extensively on topics of epistemic vice, silencing, arrogance, prejudice and ignorance. And I just discovered she's running a project on changing attitudes in public discourse, where she's focusing on reducing arrogance and debates. And today she will be speaking about anger as a speech act and its illocutionary disablement. So we are perfectly on time. So Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Let's see whether I can manage to share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to argue that silencing can occur not only when people are either locutionary or illocutionary or perlocutionary, silenced, disabled or frustrated, when they express propositional content by using standard language, but that this form silencing and in fact illocutionary disablement can occur in an emotional context. And in particular, I want to say that expressing anger can be a form of speech act, and that can be a form of speech act that is silenced, specifically can be illocutionary disabled. So this is the plan for today. I just realized I don't have a clock on me. So if somebody at some point tells me when I've got 5 minutes left, I would be grateful. So I'm going to briefly say a few things on what I take anger to be. And then I'm going to talk about 2 dimensions of anger. It's epistemic and communicative dimension. These are not the only dimensions that are important. Another very important dimension is the motivational dimension, but is irrelevant for my purposes here, so I'm not talking about it. Then I'm hoping to convince you that anger can be understood as having to be a kind of speech act, to have the sort of intentional structure that is characteristic of some speech acts. And that I'm going to also then argue that it can be illocutionary disabled in the way in which other speech acts can also be illocutionary disabled. And then, of course, sometimes illocutionary disablement is a bad thing, sometimes it's not. That will be true of anger too. But when it is a bad thing, then it can take the form of a specific kind of injustice, which Carbonell has argued is called claimant injustice. And I think that this is what can happen when anger is disabled. And then I'm going to say, if I've got time, a few things on how sometimes calls for civility actually are kinds of are actions that disable or illocutionary disable anger. I keep seeing my screen dimming. Do you have this effect as well? I hope it's not a problem. Right.
The slides, I think you, Alessandra, you're not in the presenter's mode.
Right.
Oh,
So you're not seeing the slides moving on. Is that
we did it? We do the outline on the left.
right?
So
let me stop sharing and try sharing again. Sorry about that. So
I think yeah, it needs to be in.
Would this be okay? Can you
yes.
see?
Yes.
Right. If I move forward, can you see it?
Perfect.
Perfect. Right. So this is a quote from Audre Lorde, and I want to sort of show it to you because I think it's an example that in context is the kind of illocutionary disablement that I have in mind. And so this is a famous quote from Lorde. She says, I speak out of direct and particular anger at an academic conference. And the white woman says, quote, tell me how you feel, but don't say it too harshly or I cannot hear you, unquote. But is it my manner that keeps her from hearing or the threat of a message that her life may change? And so it's this idea, tell me how you feel, but don't say it too harshly, that I think is an instance of the illocutionary disablement I want to talk about. And so now I'm going to spend some time trying to convince you that this phenomenon occurs. So first of all, what is anger? I mean, what I put on the slide is a quote from Aristotle, who says anger is a desire accompanied by mental and physical distress for apparent retaliation because of an apparent slight that was directed without justification against oneself or those near to one. There are various aspects of this definition that I don't agree with, but it gives you the basic sense that anger is to be thought as a negative emotion that is directed to somebody, the target, because of something they have done, which is the focus of the emotion, and that something is perceived, i.e. it's thought or felt by the angry person to be a slight. And that anger involves some sort of reaction as well, some kind of behavioral tendencies. And so these days people talk of anger then and define it as an emotional syndrome. So like a syndrome, it is defined by the kind of the clusters of symptoms it has. And these clusters of symptoms are feelings of heat and aggression, but also thoughts, right, that one has been slighted and so on and so forth, and also behavioral tendencies to try to get the others to behave in certain ways, perhaps to seek revenge and so on and so forth. The idea that anger is a syndrome means that not all of these components have to be present every time. It's just that they tend to cluster together, and clustering together tends to be what is characteristic of anger. I should say, I mentioned briefly that I do not agree with all the aspects of Aristotle's definition. In particular, I don't think that anger always involves a desire for revenge. It can involve a desire that the person who has committed the slight makes amends, apologizes, so on and so forth. I also should say that I'm only interested in agential anger, i.e. anger that is targeting other people. Sometimes we rage and rant against machines. Perhaps there are links between agential anger and anger directed at inanimate objects, but I'm only talking about agential anger here. And the other thing that I should say is that I use anger as an umbrella term that refers to what are actually slightly different versions of anger. One that I will have very little to say about is rage. I think rage is a kind of anger, and I think Lugones was right to say that what is distinctive of rage from other kinds of anger is that it tends to be uncommunicative. So not only I'm only interested in agential anger, I'm only interested in agential anger that tries to communicate. And so I'm not going to talk about rage. The other thing I should say is that I think of resentment as a kind of anger. So there are forms of anger that are not the same as resentment, but resentment can be thought as being in the neighborhood or a kind of anger. And finally, I should say that anger differs from contempt, which is also another emotion in the neighborhood. And it differs from contempt in two important ways. One is contempt is a global emotion. So when you have contempt, you have contempt for a person as a whole. Whilst anger has a focus and a target, i.e. you are angry at somebody for something they've done. So anger is not a global emotion. And the other difference between anger and contempt is that anger is an approach emotion, and that's why it's communicative. It is an emotion where one engages with the target of anger, whilst contempt tends to be a distancing emotion where somebody who holds somebody else in contempt does not want to have anything to do with them. So this gives you an initial feeling about anger as an emotion. It gives you an initial sense of what it might be. I hold, and this is not a view unique to me, and it is quite a common position to hold now in the philosophy of emotion, and the idea that emotions are not mere feelings, but they are also evaluations of the situation. And so in particular, anger, which is a moral emotion, is the evaluation of a situation as angersome, which is to say, is the evaluation of situation as one in which either oneself or somebody one holds dear has been slighted. And so if anger is like this, i.e. something that either represents the moral contour of a situation, or is a way in which these are presented to the person, even if anger itself doesn't have a representational content, either way, then there are norms of propriety for anger that are purely epistemic, right? If anger is an evaluation, then proper anger is anger that is a correct evaluation. In the literature, this dimension of anger is called the dimension of fittingness or aptness. So anger is said to be fitting or apt when is epistemically correct, i.e. Things are as anger presents or represents them to be, which is to say the slight as in reality occurred, and the emotion is proportional to the gravity of the slight. And so it's possible for somebody to feel and be angry when the anger is unfitting, because either the slight has not really occurred or because the reaction is disproportionate to the slight. It's also possible for there to be a situation that would merit being angry, but the person is not angry because either they fail to notice that the situation befits anger, or because they have lost respect in themselves and so don't see themselves as deserving to respond. The question of the fittingness of anger is different from the question of whether the expression of anger is justified. So it's perfectly possible that anger is fitting, and so one has some kind of reason to be angry, but that one has other reasons not to be angry. For instance, prudential reasons, it might be counterproductive and so on and so forth. And so, or it could be morally inappropriate. So to say that anger is fitting is to say that anger is apt, which is to say that you have some epistemic reasons to be angry. It doesn't mean that all things considered, being angry is the right thing to do. So, as I said, anger can be fitting. It alerts one that something can be wrong. I should say I sort of stand under no illusion that, sometimes or perhaps even often anger is not fitting. There is some empirical evidence that we have a tendency to be angry when we shouldn't be, i.e. where anger is not fitting. And so there is anger as a tendency, if untrained, to show a lot of false positives. But this only shows that it's difficult to train anger to become fitting. It doesn't show that this is impossible. And so there is such a thing as fitting anger, and I believe one can train oneself to be more accurate in one's anger. Anger can be a valuable epistemic tool. The reason why I say this is because when I'm going to talk about silencing at the end, obviously, I think that kind of silencing is most clearly morally wrong, only if the anger that is silenced is fitting. Arguably, if the silenced anger it was unfitting, perhaps it was okay to try to silence it if the expression of anger itself was ill-placed and likely to cause harm. Right. So I've said so far that anger is a moral evaluation that presents a situation or represents a situation, depending on what your view is of anger, as having certain moral features. But now I want to say that anger is not just an evaluation of a situation as having certain features. It is also a blaming response that is based on that evaluation. And so in this way, anger is a way of holding people responsible. This idea that anger and other reactive attitudes are ways of holding people responsible has been explored by Colleen McNamara, who has argued that reactive attitudes serve a communicative function. So to say that reactive attitudes like anger, resentment, guilt, and so on and so forth serve a communicative function is not to say that they are always communicated, but it is to say that the fact of communication is what these attitudes are for. So even when anger, so it's not to say that anger sometimes is not expressed. Of course, people can bottle up. But it's to say that the point of anger is to communicate. McNamara understands communication, typical of the reactive attitudes, as really a kind of signaling, as far as I understand. So their function would be to elicit the uptake of their content. And let me give you an example of something that is not a reactive attitude, but is an emotion. And you can see how this sort of communication can function in very primitive ways. So fear is an emotion that tends to be contagious. So when we see people being fearful, even if we don't know why they are fearful, we often pick up on their fear and experience fear ourselves. That's sometimes how stampedes occur. What McNamara argued is that the teleological function of fear is, at least one of the teleological functions of fear, is precisely to elicit in others the feeling of the same emotion, and to do so by means of contagion. And the view here is that this is a form of signaling. I'm going to argue that the way in which anger communicates is not this primitive, but I'm now just sort of trying to make the point that many of these emotions serve among their purposes this idea of communicating to other people by eliciting them the uptake of the emotion, which is the feeling of the emotion themselves. And what then is communicated in this way is not how the initial person feels, right? But is what is being communicated is the initial personal appraisal of the situation, right? So when the person is afraid and expresses their fear and causes other people to also feel fearful, what she is expressing is not, I am afraid. What she is expressing is, there is danger present. And what she is doing is she's seeking to elicit the uptake by other people so that they also uh, come to share that evaluation that there is danger present. This is not, so this is a form of evaluation that for McNamara pertains to emotions and to those emotions that are reactive attitudes. This is not what I mean when I say that anger is a speech act. I think anger is complicated. I think there is an extra dimension to it, but this is the primitive form of communication on which the form of communication that is typical of anger is built. So in order to start to see what this structure is of anger as a quasi-speech act, I'd like to point out that anger cannot just be an appraisal of past wrongs, of the slight that has occurred, because if it did, we would have reasons to be angry forever. Agnes Callard has a great paper on this. So if all anger is an evaluation of a past wrong, since the past wrong will have happened forever, then the reason to be angry, which is that the past wrong happened, will be there forever. And so one would have reasons to be angry forever. And therefore it's unclear why people stop being angry. I mean, they could out of exhaustion, but would there be a reason, would it be the rational thing to stop being angry? And it seems intuitively that sometimes the right thing to do is to stop being angry. So how can that be? Well, that can be because anger is not just an evaluation of a past wrong, but what else is involved? Well, several people, including Stephen Dowell, have argued that anger, he talks about resentment actually, but resentment is a kind of anger, is a form of moral address that consists in the making of a demand. And I think this is very plausible in the case of anger. So what I think the case of anger says is what anger communicates is that anger is a demand that the addressee, typically the target of the anger, comes to share the viewpoint of the emoter or the speaker, and so comes to also evaluate the situation as angersome, but to do so at least partly because the speaker demands this of him or her. So think of say a Black Lives Matter protester being angry at a policeman who has just beaten her with a baton. What that anger is trying to do is to communicate to the policeman what you have done is wrong. So to get the policeman to endorse the contest, what I've done is wrong. And to do this in part because the protester has the authority to demand this of him or her. And so what the protester is doing in being angry is asserting some kind of authority, the authority to subordinate the will of the other person to one's own will, i.e. the authority to make demands of them that they should endorse a certain evaluative viewpoint. And so, because if I'm right that this is what anger does, and I think this is what would explain when anger is quelled, then anger has this kind of quasi-aggression structure, which makes it different from the example of fear that I gave you earlier. What the angry person does in expressing anger is that he or she intends that the target endorses the evaluation contained in the anger, the moral evaluation, that recognizes that it is the intention of the emoter that the audience endorses this evaluation, but also that the audience does so partly because of their recognition that that's the intention of the emoter. And so if this is right, anger has a kind of quasi-gracious structure, which is not just elicitation of uptake, but requires a recognition of the intentions of the angry person, which have to do with the issuing of a demand. Right, so if anger really has a quasi-Gricean structure, then perhaps it can be illocutionary disabled. The illocutionary disablement of anger would be something that occurs when the force of anger as a demand goes unacknowledged. And this occurs frequently. It occurs when anger is treated as something other than the exercitive it is, right? It is in the making of a demand, it's trying to impose new obligations on the audience. When that force of anger is misrecognized because anger is treated as mere venting, i.e. as having not being a speech act at all, or is understood as kind of being a speech act, but of the wrong sort, where what the angry person does is expressing how they feel. If this is right, when these forms of silencing anger take place, and given that anger is an important way of making a moral address, of imposing novel obligations of people, is disablement prevents one from being able to assert one's moral authority in all of these contexts. And if that's right, it is a kind of claimant injustice, where claimant injustice is what occurs when moral agents are deprived of one important faculty, that capacity that is characteristic of all moral agents, which is the ability to make moral demands on other people. And then I conclude, I have no idea how long I've spoken for. I conclude by sort of saying that then if all of this is right, calls for civility always risk being forms of silencing. It doesn't need to be, and of course, not all anger is fitting, and so not all illocutionary disablement of anger is morally wrong. But when anger is fitting, calls for civility can be an illocutionary disablement of anger because they sort of silence important moral demands that one might not be able to make in any other way. And so we ought to be extremely careful whenever we engage in calls for civility, lest we illocutionary disabled some fitting anger. And I'll stop there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Alessandra. It's a wonderful talk.
I see I was on time, right?
Perfectly. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Because I had no way of telling the time.
It's perfect time for discussion. So that's what we aim to achieve here. So the floor is open for questions. So if you could put them in the chat, that would be easier.
I think Sandy has a question.
Yes, Sandy, please.
I'm happy to put it in the chat. Hi, Alessandra.
It's all good. No, I'm trying to sort of all the time scroll
okay. Okay. Alessandra, this was super fascinating and just so interesting. I think I have a small question that is merely a matter of bookkeeping, but I'm having trouble thinking about this, so I'm inviting you to comment. I'm wondering whether it's not anger per se, but its expression that is really the what you're talking about. In part because if it's anger, I'm worried that anger functions like the signaling game that you were talking about earlier on. It's not so much that I'm angry is Gricean communicates or Grice means or non-naturally means that I make this demand on you, but it's my expression, which is something that you might think of as within my control. Would you agree with that? Is that really what you're after, or do you really want to talk about anger per se?
To be honest, I do not know the answer is. I think the stuff that is interesting goes through with just the expression of anger. But the thought that I take from McNamara is that expressing it is the function of anger. So, or at least one of them, right? That all these emotions are for communication. And so insofar as the expression of anger is so closely linked to anger, it's not that you feel anger that causes you to express it. Is expression, is part of the syndrome that anger is. And so in one sense, yes, of course, without the expression, there is no communication. Because you can hide your anger, right? But on the other hand, I don't want to give the false impression that on one hand, there is the anger that then it causes his expression, which in turn, I want to say that the expression is part of what the emotional syndrome is.
The only quick follow-up, and I promise to be short, when that sense of expression is not the sense of expression I think that's relevant to Grice. That sense of expression is the sense of expression in which the beauty of a peacock's tail expresses sexual fitness. And if you want to get this into the game of Grice, my thought is you don't want to talk about that kind of expression. You want to talk about the kind of expression where I intend to cause an effect on you, exactly the kind of expression you outlined in your PowerPoints when you contrasted fear with anger.
You might be right. I need to think about it, but thank you so much.
Rebecca.
Hi. Thank you.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for this talk. I particularly like the point about the dangers of calls for civility at the end. I think that's, I'm going to be teaching MLK's letter from Birmingham jail next week, and I think I might bring that up to my students. My question is, I was wondering why you chose to sort of argue for anger as a speech act as opposed to an attitude. So I was wondering about cases where we say that someone sort of like angrily asserts something. And there I was having a hard time seeing how there was sort of like assertion as a speech act, and then anger seemed to be kind of like modifying it as an action in some ways, but I wasn't sure how to kind of think about anger as a separable speech act, and then how it can kind of like come together with something like an assertion. So I was wondering if you could say more about why I think of anger as a speech act rather than attitude that can kind of come together with speech acts like assertion. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know what you mean by attitude, but let me answer. I think partially answer your question. So I think one can, although anger often is characterized by the use of words, one can be angry in a silent manner. And I have written elsewhere that silence can be a speech act. So I don't think that you need to have words. I think all of this can function without the use of assertion, without the use of any words whatsoever. And that I think that the illocutionary force of the quasi speech act is the emotional tone, if you see what I mean, is the fact that it is anger. And that's why I don't want to sort of just say anger is a modifier. But I don't know why if I may ask a question, I don't know why what you mean by attitude.
I'm not sure if I know either. I think I was thinking that, that anger could be something like the manner in which you perform a speech act. So maybe manner would be a better word than attitude.
Right.
But then you could capture how sort of you could perform an assertion and maybe do what you're saying about performing the assertion with a particular kind of moral address as part of it. But where the anger would really be sort of operating on a different speech act rather than sort of being a speech act. But I'm open to.
No, I see. So I think it's certainly possible, right? I mean, it's certainly common that people make assertions and do so when angry, right? So I don't want to say that is not the case, but then it's possible, right? That is a complex, speech act, which involves both the asserting bit and the distinct speech act, which is the angry bit. So I think it's, you can account for those phenomena. The reason why I asked about attitude is because what I was talking about here, where is anger as an episodic emotion, right? But I believe that anger can also be an emotional orientation. So, or at least it might be said to be an emotional orientation. So you can talk about somebody being an angry person. And what you mean by that is that they have a tendency to be angry all the time. So I didn't know whether you meant, so I think in that sense, anger is a kind of attitude, in my sense of an attitude, which is not the philosophical sense. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about people who have a tendency to be angry all the time. I was talking about episodes of anger.
Thank you.
Right, so we have a question from Bianca.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Alessandra, for your great talk. I'm curious about your conclusions. So towards the end, you said how calls for civility are a form of social control, and that they may involve this illocutionary disablement. But I was wondering whether you'd rather say that certain calls for civility run this risk, or that all calls for civility perform this illocutionary disablement, except this illocutionary disablement is sometimes justified.
Bianca, that is a great question. What do I want to say? I don't know. It's a great question. I think I want to say the second. I thought I wanted to say the first, but I want to say the second.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I need to think about it, but yeah. I think I want to say the second. So I want to say calls for civility, always illocutionary disable, but sometimes that's fine.
Right.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Right. Any other questions? You can also, raise your hand. Yes, Jacobo.
Oh, hi. Hello. Thank you. I really loved your talk. Thank you very much. So I wondered whether you could tell us more about whether you're also already considering the criteria for who's entitled or who has the authority to evaluate the potential wrong in the anger being muted. For example, if you think that there tends to be an overarching criterion, or whether it's going to be a case-by-case story, or for example, if it's more going to be on the side of the consequences, or something more like a sentimentalist criterion, because sometimes listening to the aptness that you were describing, we were reminded a little bit of something like a spectator, an impartial spectator experience in evaluating if it is the wrongness. But is there a specific privilege of the party of the angry party, for example, or is that a social evaluation where there is a different distribution of authority?
Thank you. So I don't know what I want to say, but I've made some progress, but I'm not 100%. So one of the things that that I think is important to consider when illocutionary disablement is acceptable and when it isn't, one of the things to consider is whether the anger is fitting. And the way I am thinking of fittingness is for the purpose of this talk, and I think it is my view, is that if it gets the moral contours of the situation right, and those are independent of the assessment. And so if I go that way, which is the way I'm inclined to go, then the real problem is that none of us as privileged, none of us has infallible access. And in fact, none of us has privilege access unless you have trained your anger, because we know that, I mean, we have empirical results that show that anger tends to give a lot of false positives, right? So people tend to be angry when they have no right to be angry because anger is not fitting, right? And so to some extent, I mean, the problem here remains. But what I'm inclined to say, and maybe it's a cop-out, but is that as a kind of policy, I think people who are systematically disempowered or belong to social groups that systematically suffer from injustices, you kind of have some evidence, that they are likely to have faced injustices, that they are likely to have elicited anger, and so that you better listen. It might turn out that they were wrong, but perhaps your best approach is to give them the benefit of the doubt and presume that their anger is correct, provided that they pertain to groups that you antecedently know tend to suffer from general injustice. So one of the things, I think this is relevant to the question. So one of the things I'm interested in is I work on the assumption that when you're faced with somebody's anger, you do not know whether it's fitting or not. And then the question is, how should I react to it? And one of the things that I'm really interested in is that it seems to me important, if you have members of a group that tend to suffer from injustice, that you don't put on them the extra burden of emotional regulation. There's a wonderful paper by Archer and Mills that's just come out, right, on the burden of emotional regulation. So it seems to me that you do not call for civility, to some extent is calling them to regulate their emotions, that you do not do that, and that if you pertain in that situation to a group that is typically privileged, that perhaps you have to give them the benefit of the doubt and listen, and therefore put yourself in a position to then better evaluate whether the anger is fitting, rather than disable it. So the answer is, I don't think that, I tend to think that whether it's fitting or not is an objective matter, that none of us has infallible access to this, but that we can use social privilege as a sort of proxy for when we should give the benefit of the doubt and what sort of attitude we should take in response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was your question, Jacopo, or you have another one just to keep track?
No, yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Rob Simpson.
Thanks, Alessandra. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks very much for the paper. I guess I was interested in whether there might be scope to give a more fine-grained account of what you have in mind when you speak of calls for civility, especially given your answer to Bianca's question, where you want to say that whether or not it's justified. Every instance of a call for civility has the kind of silencing function that you've described. I mean, it might just be an issue of terminology, but I suspect there's more to it than that. Calls for civility seems like a very broad strokes way of capturing the sort of dialogical act that has the silencing function that you're interested in. For one thing, not all calls for civility happen in the context of a dialogical back and forth where someone has expressed anger and then the call for civility functions as a rejoinder to the expression of anger. And so, you know, I'm thinking about books that I've read by Amy Olberding and Teresa Bejan and people who write on civility, where they do have a certain account of what civility is, and they're enjoining us to take civility seriously. And, you know, I sort of think someone whipping out their Teresa Bejan and saying, look, you're supposed to be civil as a response to someone else's expression of anger is silencing in a way that Bejan's writing of that book itself can't necessarily be sort of accused of having the same kind of silencing effect. So I guess the thought is, or the suggestion is, might we be more granular or fine-grained about exactly what it is in a call for civility that has the silencing function? And then a couple of suggestions of what the sort of more finely specified features might be. One being the one that I've already sort of adverted to there, that it has a kind of a dialogical positioning in an exchange of views. It comes in response to expressions of anger. And secondly, which, you know, sort of you alluded to in your previous answer, that it seems like the most potent forms of silencing, you know, of the sort that you're trying to flesh out here is stuff that kind of takes advantage of racialized or gendered stereotypes about anger to sort of discredit, you know, exactly like what's illustrated in the example that you gave us from Lord at the start, right? That's it. You might think that that's not just a kind of an accidental feature of the instances of calls for civility that have this silencing function, but that's actually kind of either essential to or characteristic of the silencing acts that you're really kind of interested in here.
Yeah, so originally, I mean, this is what happens when you adapt slides from a different talk. So really what I wanted to talk about in this context was tone policing. And, you know, and you are absolutely right. Not all calls for civility take the form of tone policing. And what I'm interested in really are those calls for civility that tells people, you know, you need to tone it down. And so those are the cases really that I had in mind, that, and they are like the Lord case. I mean, I think things that are very interesting about the quote from Lord is where the person says, you know, tell me how you feel, right? And I think that already is a kind of disablement, because it takes the anger to be an expression of an inner feeling, right? Rather than an evaluation of the moral situation. And then it says, tone it down, right? Don't say it so harshly. So those, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's that sort of what Alison Bailey has called tone policing. That's what I'm really interested in, rather than academics who write books about the toleration in early modern, you know, Europe and the States. By the way, the Bejan book is a fantastic book on civility, I think. You know, I didn't have in mind things like that. So yeah, absolutely right.
Any other questions? You can even just raise your hand if I can't see you, or put the questions in the chat. The fact that you have a question. I can't see anyone for the moment. Okay. If I may, Alessandra, I'm interested in one question, although it's not particularly like focused on your talk. I'm thinking about the sort of suppressed anger that let's say marginalized groups, or being in a powerless position, you sort of, and maybe that comes to Sandy's point about feeling or experiencing anger versus expressing it. So at which point or under what conditions would you predict that, let's say, the powerless would basically unleash the suppressed power that they have to hide or conceal just to self-preserve in various threatening situations? Is there a way that we can think about that? What is it that the powerless is doing when eventually within the group, let's say, they are expressing power, or at least they're sharing it, like in a sort of solidarity spirit, anger towards, let's say, a third party that disadvantages them, or so, whatever the situation is. Is that a sort of speech act that they're doing? And under what conditions would they be ready to, tip over and really express it over into a public forum?
Yeah, so I hope I got the question right. So it seemed to me, so your case is when somebody is angry in the presence of an audience which is not the target of the anger. Right, yeah, it's sort of hidden. Yeah, so there are two cases of that that I think are different, or at least there are at least two cases of that I think are different. So the first case, and this is something that Archer sort of pointed out to me, which is, take two children and one has done something to the other, and the second one is angry but goes to the parent to be angry, but is angry at the sibling, but right? And then there is the case you are talking about. Now, I think the first kind of case is completely different. I think the anger with the parent is anger directed at the parent for not doing anything about this annoying sibling. Your case, I think, is a case where you enjoin other people to share the anger with you. So I think there is evidence, empirical evidence, that those are cases where anger communicates by contagion. So you also have that signaling function. And people have studied that, and they claim that anger functions that way. It seems to especially function that way online. This is something I'm going to talk about in my next talk. So anger is something that is widely shared online, and there are reasons why that's so. And that seems to be a kind of emotional contagion. So that's the primitive version. I also think that the primitive communicative one. I also think that even in those cases, you could direct your anger at an absent target and enjoin other people to also be angry with you at that absent target. And so I think it can be a speech act, but it's different from the speech act that I had in mind, because what I had in mind is this anger directed at the target of anger. Where what you're asking them is to elicit that, to endorse your evaluation. And so what you're eliciting in them is guilt rather than anger.
Right.
Where guilt, right? So if anger is content is so and so has slighted me or slighted somebody is near to me, if you are the target of the anger and you endorse that content, it becomes I did this, and that then the content of that is essential. It's part of the syndrome of guilt. Then the question is, of course, feeling guilty is not enough. I mean, one of the things that really outrages people is when the person has made you angry goes around and just say, I am so sorry, I am so sorry, and seems to be more concerned about being forgiven than actually do anything about it, right? And so clearly, again, the uptake of that part of the content is not sufficient. What is also required, I think, is the acknowledgement of the authoritativeness, which is what the demand part. But I think there are different speech acts, and I think the moment you start thinking of emotions as having this sort of communicative function, there is a whole area of, if you want, the philosophy of emotional language and something that is, and especially moral emotions, that I think it's really interesting and quasi-linguistic in many ways. I mean, not completely, but
yeah, I can see that, and in a way, but probably it will help. So there is this contagion effect, within the in-group of the marginalized, the powerless, let's say, because they feel the injustice, and somehow on the one hand they can't make it manifest public overtly to the powerful, let's say, and so you have to kind of make sense of it within the group. And there is a certain contagion effect because of the injustice, so there is a compounding effect of kind of spreading. I'm not sure I understood the point about the guilt. Is that because the person who experiences anger, because they can't let it out?
No. So think of the content of the anger is, in my case, it would be, you have done this, and I'm trying to make you endorse that content, which won't be you have done this, will be I have done this, right? And so if you end up sharing that evaluation of the moral situation as one where the wrong has occurred and you have done the wrong, then presumably you are taking on responsibility for a wrong, and so presumably you feel guilty. And so one of the aims of anger, one of the ways in which anger communicates, is by making the recipient feel guilty. And it does so by making them endorse the content of the anger. But it's not enough that you endorse that content. You also have to do so partly because you acknowledge that the other has the right to demand it of you.
Right.
Or at least that's my view.
Right, that's helpful. So I see a point from Christoph, please, if you want to join us.
Yes, I was just, it's very interesting about this moral address, and with the recent protests and the way that social media tends to work these days. That is a very interesting topic, but I was just thinking, what about anger directed at oneself? Which could be quite interesting, right? Because if on the one hand you say like anger is motivated by having a certain moral view, which is different, you run into kind of an interesting situation of like cognitive dissonance, where if this endorsement of a moral content I don't hold yet is the case, how can I hold that moral stance and not hold it at the same time because I'm angry at myself? And I think like, I would say like anger directed at oneself is usually like I have certain moral standards also for myself, and then I fall short of those standards, and that's where the anger stems from. I behaved in a way that I'm not proud of, but it's just like the way you phrased it. I was sort of wondering if how you would adopt that to the case of anger directed at oneself.
Well, so presume you're angry for something you have done in the past, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe like with these protests, like you want to do something about the situation, but you feel helpless, and that sort of translates into anger because of inaction. It could be also one of those cases.
Yeah, I mean, that case, I think, I mean, I don't know, but that case could also just be a case of rage. If you remember at the start, I said I'm only talking about communicative anger. I think there are forms of anger that do not seek to communicate anything, and they are just raging, you know, at anything and everything. They don't have, you know, which is not to say that they are not based on a perception of an injustice, but they lack the target and focus in the same way. So I don't know what to say about those cases, but the case of anger being directed at oneself, it is a case where I think one sees oneself as not having had an accurate perception of the situation. And now there you have, you sort of are annoyed that you didn't, and try to make yourself in future endorse the point of view of the current self rather than the past self. So I tend to see it, you know, if you want, I mean, I don't like talking about stages of personality, but the kind of demand you're making is a demand you're making to yourself to share the current evaluation of the situation rather than the one that presumably guided your action in the past. Mm. And so you can make onto yourself demands. And I think that's what anger is in the case of directed to the self.
It's just very interesting because people would just naturally call that anger directed at oneself. And there's certainly a moral dimension, but at the same time, it's not the kind of morality between people because it's just you sort of negotiating with what moral standards you put up for yourself. And certainly it could be on a dimension of like being very expressive, like rage. It could be kind of a suppressed thing as well. It could be disappointment to some extent. So I see your point. Maybe we don't want to call that anger, but it's just very peculiar that a lot of people would say this is anger.
No, but it could be anger, and it could be anger in the model I'm saying. You know, it's just that this time you're issuing demands to yourself.
Mm. Yeah.
Maybe we could gently move on.
Yes.
We're kind of out of time, but I see very quickly a finger from Zubeida. If we could ask your question very briefly. Hi. Microphone.
Sorry, I missed your first 10 minutes. If you mentioned that, I'm sorry if I ask you, but I wanted to maybe tell me what you think about the distinction between hate and anger, because in my mind at some point I have Kant's distinction between anger and hate he makes, and he is saying that hate is a kind of very momentary and the person is very reactioning in that moment, but after that we become deliberation comes after that. But hatred is like a long-term emotion, and you actually in a small moment of time, a longer moment of time, you are actually constructing your hatred more and more, and you are deliberating. You are even maybe faking some rational arguments you might put in to your emotions. I just wanted to, sometimes in some questions I felt like maybe we are sometimes thinking about hatred rather than anger. I just wanted to hear what you think about the distinction between hate and anger. Thank you.
Thanks. So I didn't really talk about it apart from at the beginning say I think they are different. So I think you can definitely be angry with people without hating them. You can be angry at your friends, but you don't hate your friends. I also think that anger is an approach emotion, as I said, is unless it's rage, it tends to move you to engage with the person you're angry with, even if maybe you want to let it be, but you can't help it. You are engaging. Whereas hatred can be like contempt, a distance emotion. So I think they are different in at least those two dimensions. arguably, some people think that anger can be transitional, i.e. it can be a thing that pass, and it's something that allows you to maintain self-respect in the face of a wrong. Hatred seems to serve a different function, but I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought about hatred very much.
Okay, so there is Jacopo who has a follow-up question, but since we're already in the break, you can continue, of course. So we get back in actually 7 minutes. So thank you again, Alessandra, for a wonderful talk, and thank you for a wonderful discussion. Thanks. Let's see. Okay, so see you in a bit.
Sandy, how are things in Northwestern?
Things are good. Things are good. I was just writing you a longer email because I have it, or a longer thing here because I had another question for you, Alessandra. This is a fascinating topic. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness on this. What about extending it to other emotions? Like, for example, I come from a very expressive family, and my kids often will come to either Judy or to me and express their joy about something. I'm wondering, it strikes me that I would be doing something wrong if I said, okay, can you please explain to me what's going on, but stop being so emotional about it?
Yeah.
And if that's right, one other thought that I had, and then I want to just hear your thoughts on this. So I love your comment that, and this from the ethics literature, that anger makes a demand. That strikes me as right. Joy doesn't make a demand. It strikes me that joy invites you to share.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the illocutionary force in your terms of these different emotions might be different.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I think anger, it's sort of, to me, it was so clearly, had this structure that is not just fear, it's not like just signaling. And so because I'd written on arrogance, and anger is sort of a friend of it, that's why I sort of extended it that way. But I think you're right. I mean, I think joy is an example. There is all the gratitude. I mean, there are so many of these sort of emotions that serve complicated roles in communication that nothing else could do or in the same way. And that stripping the communication of that, there is something really morally wrong that cuts very deep. I don't know, but yes, but joy is a great example.
I was thinking of it just because of your really the talk here about how it's not just that. So before your talk, I was thinking, okay, emotions have a function. Their function is a lot like their signaling, if you like. You can think of them as Millikan functions. And your point is, yeah, wait a second, if that's all you think of emotions as doing, you're missing the Gracian communicative aspect. And you convinced me that there is one. And so now I'm beginning to wonder, across the range, what are the various illocutionary acts that go with them? You have, I mean, I'm trying to think, do we even think that fear has one? Fear does seem to me to operate much more biologically, if you like, in terms of just signaling.
The one I think has one is shame. I think shame, I mean, partly because, there is that existentialist literature on shame. They sort of say, it's sort of Sartre, and my colleague Jonathan Webb has convinced me that the reason why Sartre thinks that shame is when you realize that there are others, is that shame is this sense of looking at yourself from the eyes of another person, sort of seeing you. And I wonder whether there is also sort of strange intentional structure, right? That I don't know what it is. I think it's self-directed. So I'm interested in these emotions that are often self-directed rather than other directed. And those two seems to be strange way of sort of communicating to the self. And that too is interesting. But I'm not, I mean, anger is the only one that I've sort of, been working on, partially because there is such an extensive Afro-American literature, as in literature, Baldwin, the Invisible Man, all sorts of novelists who have, given such strong phenomenological descriptions of anger being a pervasive feature. And I've been interested in sort of trying to figure out how do you do justice to that without construing it just, venting.
That's a great question. Great question.
I'm also Italian, so as you,
Yeah. I imagine that my family practice and your family practice may be very similar in that respect.
And so, I always thought that a great way of communicating was through gestures.
It's delightful to see you. It's a shame that it has to always be Zoom, but it's delightful to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I mean, this year I'm doing 2 APAs and I'm not moving from this room.